about the experiences of indigenous people, past and present. Our next guest is one native voice who's challenging some of the foundational stories we tell about this country. In his recently launched book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, Dr. Kyle T. Mays, who is Saginaw Anishinaabe, examines both the enslavement of Africans and native dispossession, revealing how the two were deeply intertwined. It's an incredible book, and honestly, it's one of the first to offer simultaneous accounts of Black and indigenous resistance on these lands.
And, you know, you have even today, Hopteps, if you will, who claim that there are the original peoples. And we have to dispel that myth because it's dangerous rhetoric that erases indigenous peoples.
Say a little bit more about that. When you say that, and I don't particularly use the term Hotep, but you're saying that there are pockets of thought that would suggest that African people or Black people are the original people. And are you saying that it's inadequate as an analysis because we should say that there are multiple original peoples, or are you saying that Black people aren't the original people and that indigenous people are? I'm just trying to clarify for the audience.
Right. So there's a segment, especially through social media, and I've been attacked and been claimed to be a part of the Copper tribe. I have no idea what that is. And they say that Black people are the original peoples of the U.S. With no historical documentation.
US, gotcha.
And it ignores Native peoples' histories of, you know, how long they've been here, right? Creation stories. And it's just a dangerous thing that perpetuates the erasure of Native peoples, which is central to American history and popular culture.
Indigenous Afro-American DNA is haplogroup R1. In this video, we will talk about genetics. Afro-Americans are indigenous to North America. We are indigenous because our ancestors were Black Native Americans, Black Europeans, and Sub-Saharan Africans. Most geneticists claim that Afro-Americans are not Native Americans because they say we don't carry Native American genes. This is a lie, because Mongoloid Native Americans and Afro-Americans carry genes that originated in Africa and are still carried by Africans today.
But we have not detected any African-like populations in the New World, to my knowledge. And African populations are very, very genetically distinct. The separation between African populations and non-African populations occurred anywhere between 60 to 200,000 years ago, depending on the African population that you are, thinking of. So, for example, West Africans, the most likely donor population in the New World, and the donor population to the African diaspora in the New World, diverged from Eurasians on the order of 60 to 100,000 years ago. And so they show up, when they show up in the ancient DNA, they're very clear, they're very distinct. And to my knowledge, we don't see any of this in the New World samples before 1492.
We'd uncovered an astounding secret. If Africa was the cradle of mankind, then Central Asia was its nursery. The discovery of the Central Asian marker had changed our understanding of the journey made by the first Europeans. But was Europe the only destination for these formidable Central Asian hunters? Did their journey take them anywhere else? We widened our search and were in for an even bigger surprise. The markers seemed to be everywhere we looked. From Europe, through Asia, Russia, North and South America, the list seemed to be endless.
A bizarre sea of faces. And you can tell so much from a face, or can you? Where are we now? We could be anywhere across the continent of Eurasia, but in fact, we're right at the very heart of it, in Central Asia. China is a few miles in that direction, Afghanistan a few hundred miles to the south. This is really the crossing point, the central part of the continent of Eurasia.
And I've come back for a very special reason. Hidden in the samples of those 2,000 Central Asians was one extraordinary individual. His name is Niazov, and he's directly descended from the man whose DNA, 40,000 years ago, had a tiny spelling mistake, the Central Asian marker. This genetic marker has spread throughout the Northern Hemisphere and been inherited by over 1 billion people. Branches of Niazov's ancestors went on to people Europe, parts of India, Russia, and America, but Niazov's family has always stayed here. Analyzing his DNA for the first time was an extraordinary moment. In an instant, I knew we'd discovered something very important. Now we're going to meet him. After nearly 2,000 generations, Niazov still lives in Central Asia. I'm excited about meeting him again, now that I fully understand the history he holds in his blood. I'm on the track of one man whose blood tells the story of the most extraordinary journey in history. The children of this man's great ancestor became Native Americans, Europeans, Asians, and Russians. Some even made it down into India. But very, very excited. We're about to go in and meet somebody who plays a critical role in our understanding of the genetic history of Eurasia. He gives us a direct line back to the ancestors of most Europeans, Native Americans, and a lot of Indians. So let's go see him.
Заходите.
Niazov? Здравствуйте.
Очень приятно. С вами тоже очень приятно.
Should take the shoes off.
Пожалуйста, давайте, проходите.
This is an extraordinary moment. You can make discoveries in a lab, but to put a face to a genetic marker as ancient as this, well, for me, it's truly amazing. He may be shorter than I am, but he's a genetic giant in our history. I'm gonna have to give him my blood speech, though. Hope it doesn't put him off. What if I told you that your blood takes us back in history 40,000 years? Your lineage takes us back to the very first Central Asians, before Uyghurs, before Pamiris, before Tajiks, the very first people who lived here.
Только
Do you know what DNA is?
Вы знаете ДНК?
я знаю, да, конечно.
He have heard.
So it's the blueprint. That it's your instruction book. It's how to make
То есть это
another version
ДНК
of you.
дает вашу детям.
Now, the thing that we've been studying is known as the Y chromosome. And this is a small piece of DNA that doesn't really do very much except to make you male. So your Y chromosome you got from your father.
Чтоб чистый.
То есть вы
Чистый.
Вот мой отец.
Pure.
This is a picture of his father.
Вот отец. Вот который
Центре, да?
середине. А это дедушка.
And a grandfather.
Дедушка.
That's great.
Father and grandfather.
That's fantastic. So that is a lineage, okay? Your Y chromosome came from him to him to you. Now, if we trace back even further, so we go from you to your father, to your grandfather,
Если
to
мы
his father,
проследим,
and so on and so on and so on, back through nearly 2,000 generations. If we do that, we reach a single man, one man.
то есть когда мы это делаем, то есть вы, допустим, один человек, берем как человек,
Who was living in southern Central Asia.
который живет в центре Средней Азии, то есть Евразии, в центре континента. Мы живем, да?
Да, Средняя Азия.
Сердце.
Сердце.
Around 40,000 years ago. Now, this was a very important man because
Потому что
he is the ancestor of Europeans, Native Americans, and many, many Indians. So I can tell you with absolute certainty
я
that
могу вам точно вот сказать, с полной уверенностью.
your Y chromosome and his Y chromosome and his Y chromosome, they've been here for 40,000 years.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Мой кровь из нас чистый.
That means my blood is pure.
We now have Olmec DNA. Enrique Villamar Serrell has found that the Olmec carried mtDNA A, which is a subclass of the microhaplogroup N. Haplogroup N originated in Africa.
Yeah, so I think the issue here is, part of it is, I don't think we have DNA directly from the Olmecs. What we need to do is kind of get them in the scaffold of the genomic history of the Americas, which has been established now.
We found that there were 5 primary mitochondrial DNA lineages present. These lineages have become designated by letter names in the scientific world. And the ones that we see in Native American populations were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X. And these 5 lineages are ones that are common today in Native Americans, and they were the ones that were present in these ancient communities, were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X. Were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X.
Stephen L. Whittington, for example, is one of the leading experts on the genetics of the peoples of Central America.
Most of my research has taken place in the Maya area. The evidence acceptable to most archaeologists and physical anthropologists, both from dental traits and from mitochondrial DNA, is that the origin of people in North, Central, and South America before the coming of the Europeans in 1492 was North Asia.
Let's talk about a little bit more about reduction. In dealing with the recent cover story in the New York Times here in the Americas. Now, for those who didn't see the article, scientists recently analyzed the DNA and the skull of a prehistoric teen girl. The skull was discovered in an underwater cave in Mexico. This tells us something about how the Americas were populated before the European colonies, but explain the science here.
So the idea is that they're gonna take the skull from this individual who has been very well preserved, and they extract some small amount of DNA from it. And the DNA that you use to trace your genealogies, so you know your mother gives you DNA, right? You have your mother's DNA, so that you can do the same sort of tracing, just very, very far back in time. And this individual, if you look at, for example, their maternal DNA, you can actually trace it among other Native American populations, and eventually even among Asian populations. You can sort of connect all these different lines, which allows you to understand where people have common ancestors. And the Native Americans, as this study is an example of, have a common ancestor with populations in Northern Asia. So it's very clear that their ancestors, or many of their ancestors, came from Northern Asia and moved into the Americas, and eventually were very successful and colonized the entire American continent.
And the water helped preserve, because we were talking earlier about there not being much DNA in hair strands, but this thousands of years old. How?
Right, so in certain environments, particularly cold environments, the DNA can actually be well preserved. There's some amazing studies where they've looked at mammoth bones that are preserved basically in the permafrost, and you know, they're 100,000 years old. I mean, you can get DNA out of Neanderthals now. It's really very incredible.
Recently, new inroads in the research on human DNA has allowed scientists to determine the relatedness of different populations around the world. Children inherit a mixture of their parents' DNA, which is a mixture of their grandparents' DNA, and so forth. With each subsequent generation, that DNA becomes increasingly mixed and blended with DNA from other ancestors. However, smaller, isolated amounts of DNA exist in the cells of both fathers and mothers that do not mix when passed to their children. The father's Y chromosome DNA remains intact as it is passed down to his son, and to his son's son, and so on through multiple generations. In the same way, the mother's mitochondrial DNA also remains intact as it is passed down to both her sons and daughters, from one generation to the next. Scientists are then able to trace these intact DNA markers back through hundreds of generations to determine ancestry. When the Y chromosomes or mitochondrial DNA are tested in hundreds or even thousands of individuals from two different populations of people, the results can be compared to see how similar or dissimilar these intact DNA markers are between people groups.
If Y chromosomes all come from Asia and mitochondrial genomes all come from Asia, then the only explanation for where all the rest of the chromosomes come from is Asia. That is a very scientifically valid explanation. It's the only explanation. In excess of 150 tribes have been tested now, and these are scattered all over North and Central and South America, even to Greenland. And from that survey, in excess of 5,500 individuals have been involved and been tested. From those 5,500, 99.4% of Native Americans have a mitochondrial DNA lineage that originated in Asia. There can be no question. 99.4%. The other 0.6% have either a European or an African mitochondrial lineage. A very tiny minority of African and European lineages that they do find came after Columbus.
In living Native Americans' DNA, there will inevitably be a few individuals, even in the most remote Native communities, that have had some intermarriage with Europeans or Africans. And that'll show up in their DNA. But that small percentage that's there can be distinguished by looking at the dates in which those types of lineages separated from other forms of DNA very similar to them. And so, in other words, you can identify which ones came after 1492.
Really, there was not only DNA evidence, but now, as it turns out, there's no linguistic, there's no archaeological evidence. There's essentially nothing to link the old world with the new world.
Not in genetics, or for that matter, in any other source, historical, archaeological, or linguistic.
It tells us that that these individuals that were living in Siberia, in south central Siberia at 24,000 years ago, their genes contributed to first Americans' genes. At least 14 to 38% of Native Americans that live in North and South America today share their genetic makeup with the Malta boy. I think what it does is it helps to clarify some things, and the first is that the first Americans came from Siberia. It helps to clarify that question. Some archaeologists have suggested that the first Americans could have come from Europe directly via a transoceanic migration, and I think that this does a fairly good job clarifying that it was via a land migration, or at least a coastal migration through Beringia.
But we know where they in fact came from, and that's from the northern part of East Asia.
The people that we can identify today as Native Americans, the people that we can pull DNA from, their genetic markers are more closely related to people from Siberia.
Recently, I've been involved in a number of research projects that have examined DNA variation in ancient populations in the Americas. I don't know of any data that suggest particular similarity of Native American populations to any population.
This is a very large field of study now, where there are dozens of researchers who've worked in over 6 dozen Native American communities, investigating thousands of individuals. And the genetic data from every single one of those studies is telling us the same thing. That is, that the people came from, the American Indians came from north part of East Asia.
The DNA data indicate the closest affinities of contemporary Native American populations are with populations in East Asia and Central Asia.
The genetic evidence shows that the American Indian came from Asia.
Genetically, we're so close. Yet from here in Central Asia, the descendants of Niazov's ancestral grandfather ventured out to give us an incredible diversity of looks. One group traveled west along the plains of Asia to become the first Europeans. But one branch of Niazov's family reached the Americas. Their children are the Native Americans, from the Inuit to the Incas. To get there, they had to embark on a journey into climatic extremes beyond anything endured before. Remember the Ice Age? Well, 20,000 years ago, it was at its most extreme. And yet, our research shows that that's when they headed straight into its bitter heart. Some of them are still there. Niazov's ancient marker shows up in a nomadic tribe deep in the Russian Arctic. They're called the Chukchi, and they're survivors from the Great Migration to the Americas 15,000 years ago. Somehow, they're better able to cope with the cold. And Nina Jablonski knows why.
The Chukchis are a classic example of what has been referred to in human biology as Bergmann's and Allen's rules. That is, in a very cold climate, the surface area of the body will be reduced and the length of the appendages will be reduced. So the people tend to have shorter arms and legs, shorter fingers, and a shorter and rounder trunk to reduce the surface area through which heat can be lost. In that way, they're wonderful furnaces, as it were, for preserving their own body heat.
The Chukchi's ancestors had followed the reindeer eastwards. After thousands of years, they ended up here at the eastern tip of Russia.
I'm off to meet an ancient tribe who traced their family line back to Siberia, to the ancestors of the Chukchi who made that first migration into the Americas. They're the Navajo, and they live here in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona.
The Navajo Indians have been living in North America ever since their Chukchi ancestors first arrived. Canyon de Chelly is one of their most sacred sites. I wanted to tell them about the genetic trail that had led me to them.
One that went inland.
I'm getting pretty good at this. Of course, it helps that I brought the family album along.
And this man is a direct descendant of a person who lived in Central Asia about 35 to 40,000 years ago.
Wow.
And his ancestor is also the ancestor of most Europeans and Native Americans.
Wow.
He's a man called Niazov, who lives in Kazakhstan.
Are you the same person that did some research I noticed on the internet that says that the Native American people are somehow connected to Central Europe?
Yes, Central Asia.
Central Asia.
Yeah, that was a paper that we published last year.
Okay. That's good to know.
What do you think of that?
You know, I was looking at a book from people from Central Asia, and I saw my cousin Emmett and Abraham, Auntie Grandma Buggy, and I said, my God, I got family over there in Central Asia.
These are the Chukchi people, and they're your distant cousins. They're still living in northeastern Siberia. I visited them recently.
Oh, they're the ones that have
With the reindeer.
With the reindeer.
Reindeer. I've seen them on TV.
Their home is...
Yeah, the home looks like a teepee.
My story about the journey of man came as no surprise to these Navajo. The idea of migration had been central to their own creation story since the beginning of time.
The point is that somehow we're finally acknowledging one another from the scientific realm and from the traditional realm, saying that, yeah, the puzzle is starting to fit together.
And we complement each other.
And we're all complementing each other.
It was one of those things no one ever doubted. The first people on this continent were the Indians, period. No reason to believe otherwise. But 2 summers ago in the town of Kennewick, Washington, a skeleton turned up that could turn out to be the missing link between what we thought to be the truth and what actually is the truth. A truth, if it is the truth, that the Indians are not happy with. July 1996. 2 college students wading through shallow waters near the edge of the Columbia River literally stumbled on a human skull. The county coroner, thinking he might have a recent murder on his hands, called in Jim Chatters, a local forensic archaeologist, to investigate.
The whole skeleton was scattered on the beach, just strewn in the mud of the reservoir.
When Chatters assembled the bones of an adult male on his office lab table, he knew right away this was not a recent case.
Who did you think he was at first, when you first examined him?
It looked like he was probably a white settler, a European settler.
European settler what, in the 19th century?
Late 19th, early 20th century, right.
But that didn't make sense when Chatters then discovered what looked like a prehistoric stone spear point embedded in the skeleton's hip. So he sent a tiny piece of bone off for radiocarbon dating and got back the news of a lifetime. The skeleton on his lab table was over 9,000 years old, one of the oldest intact skeletons ever found in North America, a scientific treasure.
And I just kind of let out a hoop and just, I don't believe this. Yeah.
Chatters got to the point where he was almost communing with Kennewick Man, who he thinks may have looked like the actor Patrick Stewart.
Was he handsome?
In the sense that handsome people are those with a high degree of facial symmetry, yes.
Kennewick Man was coming to life before Chatter's eyes. He wanted to learn more, but he had a problem.
We regard human remains as sacred, period.
Armand Minthorn is a religious leader of the Umatilla Indian tribe. The Umatillas, together with 4 other local tribes, said that any man who lived along the Columbia River 9,000 years ago had to be their ancestor. They demanded the right to bury him immediately.
Our older people tell us that when a body goes into the ground, that's where it's to remain until the end of time.
Specifically, a federal law passed in 1990 that gave Native Americans the right to the remains of their ancestors. But that's where things got dicey, because based on his preliminary research, Jim Chatter speculated that Kennewick Man was probably not an ancestor of the American Indians, which would mean the Indians may not have been the first people in North America. He showed us a cast of an Indian skull here on the right and compared it to a cast he made of Kennewick Man's skull.
See the angularity here? The angle that it forms?
Right.
That's very typical American Indian. It's a very round head as opposed to a long, narrow head. He just jumps out at you. You could put this one in a crowd of Native American skulls. I mean, you could put him in with 100 of them and you'd still pick him right out of the crowd.
As modern studies have shown, craniofacial measurements are not as reliable as once thought to predict ancestral relations between populations because craniofacial plasticity is subject to change by the forces of the environment. Frank Boas, one of the pioneers of anthropology, as we know it today, stated as early as 1916 that craniofacial measurements could vary from one generation to the next in studies of immigrants and their children. Racialists of course scoffed at this idea. But modern studies like that of Dr. Gravely, in 2003, have vindicated his claims.
This is a first glance, so I don't have a sense of time on him. All I have is just his physical features to work with. Very long, narrow brain case, fairly distinct brow, and a nose that just jumps off his face. Very pronounced nose. These are all characteristics we more often see on Western Eurasian skeletons.
Dr. Chatters, who was a little-known anthropologist of no marked repute, became famous overnight because of his foolish claims of Kennewick Man. Of course, to Chatters, a face like that of known Native American activist and actor, Wes Studi, must be European because he has a long narrow skull shape and his nose just jumps off his face. If we want to buy into all these craniometric claims, then we should consider the fact that Kennewick Man is one lone individual, not a statistical sampling of various individuals. So finding which population average might be closest is irrelevant. We can look at Howell's database and find which individuals are closest in proportions to Kennewick Man overall. The closest cranial comparison is not Ainu, Norse, or any other Old World skull, it is a 27-year-old Eskimo skull. So much for the craniometric claim that Kennewick Man was European. The fact of the matter is that all ancient North American skulls fall within the Native American range overall, and even the more extreme variations are still explainable as plesiomorphic features that evolved into the present Native Americans. More importantly, all have been found on the western USA and Mexico, not the East Coast.
Nearly 2 decades after the ancient skeleton called Kennewick Man was discovered on the banks of the Columbia River, the mystery of its origins appears to be nearing resolution. Genetic analysis, preliminary results, point to Native American heritage. The researchers performing the DNA analysis feel that Kennewick has normal standard Native American genetics, according to a 2013 email to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is responsible for the care and management of the bones. At present, there is no indication he has a different origin than North American Native American.
DNA samples from human remains that predate 1492 are referred to as ancient DNA.
Because of the way that science is being improved, now it's gotten to where you can actually analyze the DNA of skeletons that are, 1,000 years old.
Dr. Dennis O'Rourke of the University of Utah is one of the leading researchers in the field of ancient DNA.
Our work on ancient DNA is fairly straightforward. First, we identify prehistoric populations where skeletal material has been discovered. We take fairly small skeletal samples, usually a fragment of a rib, and it's a simple chemical process to release the nucleic acids, or the DNA, that is contained within that bony matrix. At the time of initial European contact and subsequently, all of our ancient samples predate that contact, so there's no evidence of admixture in our ancient samples.
When they test DNA isolated from the remains of Native Americans, they always find Asian lineages amongst those remains.
The story of the first Americans and the story of the ancient white migrations. What you are looking at is the oldest skull ever found in both North and South America. This skull was originally discovered on the outskirts of what is today Mexico City, Mexico. The most intriguing aspect of the skull is that it is long and narrow and typically Caucasian in appearance, like the heads of white, Western Europeans today. That is a direct quote from an article by a journalist, not an anthropologist, named Steve Connor, who wrote that article in 2002. What the makers of the first Americans video failed to quote from that article was the words of one of the most prestigious physical anthropologists of our time, Professor Chris Stringer, the head of human origins at the Natural History Museum in London. Quote, "I personally haven't found the Solutrean and Penyon connection claims very convincing. For a start, there are lots of examples in archaeology where various artifacts from different parts of the world can end up looking similar even though they have different origins. Most humans in the world at that time were long-headed, and it doesn't surprise me that Penyon woman, at 13,000 years old, is also long-headed." End quote. In other words, the trend in all humans, the ancestors of Asians, Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans, during that time period was to be long-headed, dolichocephalic. The ancient skulls found in the Americas were not some imaginary Caucasoid population. They were archaic Native Americans, ancestors of today's Native Americans. The Mongoloid look, seen in some, not all, Native Americans and Asians, doesn't even appear in Asia, or the Americas until around 9,000 years ago. Racialists must believe they were leprechauns who just magically appeared out of nowhere. Of course, if racialists paid attention to the news, they would have known that in May of 2003, Dr. Sylvia Gonzalez, of Britain's Liverpool John Moores University, announced that her DNA study of Penyon woman confirmed she had an Asian origin, just like modern Native Americans. Of course, craniometric studies such as that of Dr. Gonzalez Jose, in 2006, matched up Penyon woman with the modern Piriku, from Baja California. A study of the Piriku DNA in 2006 by Dr. Gonzalez showed that they had typical Native American mitochondrial DNA. Penyon woman, one of the oldest skulls found in the Americas, was an ancestor of today's Native Americans.
What is most significant about the genetic research is that it validates what we already knew from other scientific disciplines. From biological anthropology more generally, we knew a long time ago that American Indians resembled Asians, and particularly the people from the regions around Mongolia and Siberia. Archaeologically, we knew that there was similarity between the cultures of Northeast Asia and those of the early Americans, that is, in the types of artifacts they used and left behind. We also knew, based upon linguistic evidence, that American Indians shared a common ancestry with at least some of the Northeast Asians and the Siberians. So we had all of this other evidence from scientific disciplines as diverse as linguistics and archaeology and human biology, all showing us an Asian origin of American Indians. Now the genetic data confirms what we already knew from that other material.
Yes, the genetic data is certainly in agreement with other kinds of biological information as well as archaeology and linguistics in placing the origin, the ultimate geographic origins of the native populations of the Americas in Asia.
There is a comprehensive, widespread consensus among anthropologists today from all subdisciplines of anthropology that the homeland of Native Americans is East Asia.
There is a scientific consensus that the original peoples that came to the Americas came from Asia.
Now, DNA fingerprinting is analogous to fingerprinting leaving your fingerprints. It's a very hard science, really, when it comes down to it. It's being able to really answer very clearly what's happened, and that is that the American Indian is, at least their DNA, comes from Asia.
Finally, it appears that there may have been even a European ancient migration into the Americas. And the way we found that is we were studying a Native American tribe up in this area of central North America. And there we found a particular mitochondrial DNA lineage which looked like a European lineage over here, which we had defined as lineage X. So it was only found in Europe. It's never found in Asia. But, in fact, when we looked at this population of Native Americans, we found that fully 25% of all of the people in this area had X. Now, you could argue, oh well, X is just because since Columbus, some women came over from Europe, happened to marry with these Native Americans, and that's why European X is there. However, again, we used the molecular clock to find out when that X came. We compared the sequence of X from Europe with X from this population, and they came together 15,000 years ago. So therefore, this did not come to this region since Columbus. It came after one of the most recent glacial maxima. And so it's been proposed that, in fact, when the ice covered the area between Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, and Europe, that, in fact, some hunters actually crossed the ice sheet and colonized this part of the Americas. And Dennis Swafford of the Smithsonian has even speculated that it was this migration from Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula, that brought the unique stone culture that we know as the Clovis culture. That is the culture that's been associated with the killing of the woolly mammoths and the other large animals, and that is just the time that the Clovis culture appears in North America. And the appearance of the Clovis culture, in fact, heralded the decimation of all the large mammalian fauna.
Dr. Joe Lorenz of the Coriell Institute in Camden, New Jersey, is performing brand new analysis of the brain DNA, using techniques no one had access to back in the 1980s. Lorenz is re-examining sections of DNA called haplogroups in the brains of 5 Windover people. He's looking for haplogroups found only in native North Americans, because finding them would corroborate all previous work. In contrast to all previous findings, Lorenz couldn't confirm the Windover people were Americans. Further investigation revealed something even more remarkable.
I went back to the screen and I looked at the sequences again. The first person's DNA, it looked European. When I looked at the second one, it looked European. When I looked at the third, fourth, and fifth, they were slightly different from the first two, but they looked European.
Lorenz had found DNA unlike any other from Native Americans. Most scientists believe that some 15,000 years ago, people walked from Asia across the landmass now covered by the Bering Straits into North America. Lorenz's results could be consistent with a new and controversial theory that proposes some of the earliest people migrated to America from Europe, perhaps by crossing an Atlantic Ocean significantly narrower than it is today.
If our genetic analysis shows that these individuals really do belong to a new and previously unidentified lineage, founding lineage in the New World, it would be very big news.
So the race is on to find the final proof. But for the moment, Lorenz's work has added to the mounting evidence of an early European migration.
Revolutionary findings now show that some American Indians have mitochondrial DNA markers which are also only found in Europe, showing prior mixing with Europeans between 12,000 and 36,000 years ago. I think I will let Professor Murphy, chair of the Department of Anthropology at EDCC, do the basic explanation as to why haplotype X in Native Americans is not an indication of a European presence.
The connections that exist, such as that of haplogroup X, are from about 25,000 years ago. What you should show, if American Indians came from Europeans, what we should show is that the same haplogroups that we find in the Americas are the same haplogroups that exist in Europeans. But A, B, C, and D, the four main haplogroups that account for 98% of American Indians, are not found in Europeans. Okay, only one of those X is found there, and that one's far too old. Jeff Lindsay argues that the X haplogroup might be evidence of a connection with American Indians. He's made that argument despite the evidence that now clearly shows that the X haplogroup is found in Siberia. Or his argument requires that, in a sense, this one haplogroup that happens to have a few similarities with Siberians, American Indians, and Europeans, that itself is evidence. The problem with his scenario is that you can actually break down the haplogroup X into different categories, okay, different haplotypes. Okay? And these haplotypes, in a sense, tell us a history of haplogroup X. The haplogroup X that is found in Europeans is of a different strand than that found in American Indians. That's how we come up with the date of 25,000 years ago, or because of those differences. The Siberian haplotypes of haplogroup X are in between those of American Indians and those of Europeans, when it should be the other way around. If the American Indians came from Europeans, then it should be the European haplotypes that are more similar to the American Indians, not the Siberian ones. Siberian haplotypes of haplogroup X are between American Indians and Europeans, so that it shows that they had to have come from Siberia, not from Europeans.
Furthermore, in Kittisold's groundbreaking study of haplogroup X, they stated clearly in 2003 that when they surveyed all populations, the only one with one of the 5 mutations that characterized haplogroup X2A, the Native American haplotype, was one instance in Iran. Nowhere near Europe. Here are some images of Altayan and Evang peoples. Hardly European looking.
The stories began in the late 1700s, when white settlers pushing down the Ohio River came across mounds and earthworks like these at Marietta. Everywhere in the valley of the Ohio were immense brooding mounds and rings and lines of earthworks. To farmers, the mounds were simply a nuisance. But others saw the mounds as miraculous proof that North America's prehistory was as rich as the Old World's and Central and South America's. Who had labored to build such astonishing works? Surely not the few surly and clearly uncivilized Indians who then lived in the area. But almost anyone else was a candidate. Harvard University's Ian Brown.
They were attributed to Vikings, the Welsh, the lost tribes of Israel. You name it, every group had some sort of responsibility for the construction of the mounds, except the Indians.
By the early 1800s, the popular imagination was seized by the idea that America had once been peopled by a race of supermen, or at least of white men, or at least of people who built the mounds as they passed through North America on their way to founding the great civilizations of Mexico.
We don't know what the mound builders called themselves, but Native American tribes have their own names for them, such as the Allegheny, the Allegans, the Tallaghue, the Mundua, the Naholo, and the Asgans. They know that these mound builders were a massive and mighty nation of light-skinned people.
Perhaps DNA science can settle once and for all the biological question of who, for example, the Hopewell mound builders were.
We can use DNA to help us reconstruct the past and the history of different populations, because your DNA is passed down from your parents from generation to generation. There are certain types of DNA in particular that are very useful for reconstructing population prehistory. Your mitochondrial DNA is DNA that every person has, and you inherit it from your mother. Your mother passes it on to her children. Men don't pass it on to their children. And this type of DNA, therefore, gives us a measure of matrilineal relatedness. I collected DNA from and analyzed DNA from a couple of different Hopewell cemetery populations. When we looked at DNA from these two different Hopewell populations, from Illinois and Ohio, we found that there were 5 primary mitochondrial DNA lineages present. These lineages have become designated by letter names in the scientific world, and the ones that we see in Native American populations, both living today and in these Hopewell cemeteries, were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X. And these 5 lineages are ones that are common today in Native Americans, and they were the ones that were present in these ancient Hopewell communities.
DNA science apparently settles the biological questions of who these ancient, advanced Hopewell mound builders were.
Moroni tells Joseph that these ancient plates contain an account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from whence they sprang. For the next 3 years, Joseph Smith said he was given divine help in translating these gold plates into the Book of Mormon. The story begins in the first book of Nephi, with a Hebrew family fleeing the city of Jerusalem around 600 B.C. The father of this family was a man named Lehi. His youngest son was named Nephi. Nephi writes in 1 Nephi chapter 17, verse 8, that the Lord spake unto me, saying, Thou shalt construct a ship after the manner which I shall show thee, that I may carry thy people across these waters. After the ship was completed, Nephi says, We did put forth into the sea, and were driven forth before the wind toward the promised land. The notes suggest that this Hebrew family landed in the Americas about 589 B.C. Because a narrow neck of land is often described in the Book of Mormon account, Central America is where most LDS scholars have taught that Lehi's family landed in the New World. 2 Nephi 1:8 speaks of the Americas as being uninhabited when it says, It is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. Soon after arriving in the Americas, a division happened between Nephi and his oldest brother Laman. From this division, 2 separate nations emerged. Those who followed Nephi had God's favor and were called Nephites. 2 Nephi 5:21 describes the Nephites as being white and exceedingly fair and delightsome. The Book of Mormon teaches that the Nephites were a sophisticated people who grew into a large civilization. Helaman 3:8 describes how the Nephites populated the American continents when it says they began to cover the face of the whole earth, from sea south to the sea north, from the sea west to the sea east. Mormon 1:7 says of the growing Nephites, the whole face of the land had become covered with buildings, and the people were as numerous almost as it were the sands of the sea. The other nation grew from the people who followed Nephi's rebellious older brother Laman. They were now called Lamanites. 2 Nephi 5, verses 21 and 24 says of the rebellious Lamanites that the Lord did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them, and because of their cursing which was upon them, they did become an idle people full of mischief. The Book of Mormon at times describes the Lamanites as being even more numerous than Nephites, but far more primitive. 3 Nephi chapter 11 describes the Book of Mormon's crowning event when Jesus Christ appears in the sky when he visited the Americas around 33 A.D.
Haplogroup X is really a fascinating story because the X-Files of Native American genetics, because it burst on the scene in 1998. Scientists didn't want to believe it, but they found a new haplogroup in addition to A, B, C, D, among the Indians of the Great Lakes in particular. And that was haplogroup X. And so immediately the scientists who have a kind of idée fixe, in my opinion, set about trying to find haplogroup X in Mongolia and Siberia, because of course all American Indians, all upstanding American Indians came across the Bering Land Bridge chasing woolly mammoths, right? So they weren't able to find haplogroup X in Siberia. They found one case of it. That wasn't enough. Haplogroup X was a Eurasian type. So then they started talking about, oh, well, maybe they got here by jumping across the ice in a circumpolar fashion. Okay. Well, it kind of rested there for a while. As it turned, and last year, finally, the mystery of haplogroup X was revealed in a very important study by a team under Dr. Schluss, and he determined without any doubt that the origin of haplogroup X was the hills of Galilee. It was that clear. That's where, because where you have the greatest concentration and the greatest diversity, you have, that's the origin.
There's no controversy among DNA experts about the Middle Eastern origin of haplogroup X. The only question really is, when did it arrive in the Americas?
Most projections about ancient human history, prehistory really, are based on a mathematical and statistical model called phylogenetics.
What we find in the journals is that it is commonly thought among DNA experts that there was an outmigration of haplogroup X from the Middle East about 40,000 years ago.
That's a pure projection. You know, it's a mathematical progression going back to there based on how mitochondrial DNA mutates. Is it true? Who knows?
But what most people don't realize is that among these same experts in these same journals, there is controversy about the dating.
So, you know, I think these are projections.
The controversy is between those who assume a theory that man branched from chimps 5 to 6 million years ago versus those who are using newer actual findings from DNA pedigree studies. The theoretical dating gives much longer time frames, but the actual data shows a 20-fold reduction and would place the Middle Eastern outmigration of haplogroup X about 2,000 years ago, plus or minus.
Is it true that all Native Americans came from 10 families that stumbled across the Bering Strait chasing woolly mammoths before the last ice age? I don't think mine did.
But where else is this DNA found? And where did it originate?
The form of haplogroup X that's present in the Americas is known as haplogroup X2A. And this specific type is defined by a number of additional mutations that Native Americans who belong to haplogroup X share. This particular form of haplogroup X is not found in Europe. In fact, it's not found, as far as we know at this point in time, anywhere in Europe or Asia. But in particular, there's no recent connection to Europe and to European individuals who possess haplogroup X. The only similarities that we see are similarities that stem from much more distant, much more ancient ancestry that probably dates back 30,000, 40,000 years, perhaps somewhere in the Near East. And so what most likely happened is that this very ancient common ancestor of individuals who belong to haplogroup X had descendants who split and went two different directions. Probably some of these individuals moved to Europe, others moved towards Asia and up towards Beringia. And it appears that this Asian form of haplogroup X is what eventually made its way into the Americas. There have been some recent studies that have suggested that this particular distribution of haplogroup X in the Americas is most consistent with a migration from Asia through the Bering Strait over the land bridge and then down through the ice-free corridor. And so if individuals with haplogroup X migrated through that ice-free corridor, they would have first entered the continental United States and continental North America in the upper Great Plains, and it would make sense then that we would see the highest frequency of haplogroup X today in populations in that region.
If the Book of Mormon is not a literal history, then it should follow that what happens in it isn't history. It's a crowning event. Jesus appearing to Americas, as a light from the sky and then appearing in glory. Did that really happen? If the people didn't exist, it couldn't have happened.
The authenticity of Moroni, the golden plates, and Joseph Smith's testimony concerning them are all invalidated if in fact it is discovered that the Book of Mormon's story is not real history. The status of prophet is also at stake for Joseph Smith because he claimed the history told in the Book of Mormon was God's Word, the most correct book on earth and the keystone of the religion he was building. Now, DNA evidence directly addresses at a fundamental level the correctness of the Book of Mormon and raises a very uncomfortable question for the LDS Church. Is the Book of Mormon true?
We are in a dilemma now. The genetic evidence shows clearly that American Indians are not Hebrews. They are not Israelites. The archaeological evidence shows the Book of Mormon is not true. We as Mormons were mistaken about who American Indians are and where they came from. We have based our beliefs upon the Book of Mormon, which we thought was an accurate ancient historical record. The genetic evidence has pretty conclusively shown that that is not possibly the case.
That's a limb bone, and then there are vertebrae, bones from the backbone all the way through here. So these bones have been sealed in these sediments for tens of thousands of years and are now just appearing again. In 1959, a local archaeologist came across what looked like more ancient animal bones. But what he'd found was something even more exciting. And these are the replicas. Sticking out of the hillside here, he found the fragmented remains of 2 human femurs, or thigh bones. Radiocarbon dating revealed that the bones belonged to a person who lived here almost 13,000 years ago. And the discovery of these bones is really surprising, because back then, this island would still have been 10 kilometres away from the mainland. And that means the only way to have got here would have been by boat. So it doesn't seem so far-fetched to imagine that the very first people to reach America might also have had small boats, allowing them to travel from one headland to the next in the hope that around the corner the ice would have melted enough to allow them to feel dry land again. But perhaps that's rather a lot to read into a couple of old leg bones. It's frustrating that the archaeological evidence for such a coastal route is so scarce, but there is something else that I'm hoping will help to settle this controversy about how the Americas were colonised once and for all. John Johnson is an expert on the prehistory of the American West Coast.
But there were other genetic lineages among the Chumash that show them to be a very ancient group in this part.
And for 15 years, he's been collecting DNA from living Native Americans. John and his colleagues have pieced together what seems to be nothing less than an ancient genetic route map.
A few years ago, a friend of mine called me up and told me that they had just identified DNA from an ancient jawbone found in southern Alaska, in a cave in southern Alaska. What's so fascinating is this is a rare type of DNA. It's only found among 2% of American Indians.
When John compared the DNA from the ancient jawbone with modern samples from across the 2 continents, he noticed a pattern.
Okay, we have here in southern Alaska the original DNA from the jaw. Then we have the Chumash Indians that live in this part of California. We've also found this type in northwest Mexico. We found it among the Cayapa Indians in coastal Ecuador. We've also found it among the Mapuche Indians in southern Chile, among the Yagan people of southern Patagonia, and here in prehistoric burials in Tierra del Fuego.
All the way down the Pacific coast?
Primarily Pacific coastal in distribution.
So for you, does this really clinch it? Does this mean that there was a coastal dispersal?
I think this is the best evidence to date, indirect evidence of an ancient coastal migration, that this particular group gradually moved down the Pacific coast, taking advantage of coastal resources, and left behind descendants today who still live in all of these areas.
It feels as if the great mystery of this, our last human journey, is resolved. Looking at all these strands of evidence then, it seems the most likely route taken by the first Americans was not down through the ice sheets, as many archaeologists used to think, but all the way down along the Pacific coast of the Americas. We can imagine those first pioneers paddling along the edge of the ice some 17,000 years ago, and their descendants moving down along the coast, reaching the southernmost tip of the Americas within just a couple of thousand years. With a foothold in this new world, the first Americans flourished here until eventually, some 15,000 years later, they were to come face to face with some distant members of their family tree. In 1492, a small group of European explorers arrived on the shores of the Americas, where they were met by bewildered locals.